Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of our Indigenous Mascot series. As always, we thank you so much for coming back and watching the next video. We would like to remind everyone that the bibliography will be in the description of this video, and to keep in mind that many of our sources are written in the American context, so some language will be different than what we are used to here in Canada. Here in Canada, we use the term Indigenous, whereas in the United States, other terms that are commonly used vary from what we know in Canada. In today's episode, we will be discussing different cases of Indigenous mascots. We will discuss how these cases have played out if they no longer exist, how people felt about them, and what we can do to continue this mascot discussion. We will continue to look into how these mascots contribute to the system that is settler colonialism and systemic racism. Something that I feel is important to mention in this video is that the point of advocating against Indigenous mascots is so that we don't have to see these mascots, we don't have to hear these racial slurs, and we don't have to continue to contribute to settler colonialism. Out of respect for these purposes, I will not be using these slurs as the team name. I will either be referring to them vaguely, or I will be referring to them as the name that they were given once the Indigenous mascot was revoked. In Laurel R. Davis Delano's paper, Eliminating Native American Mascots, Ingredients for Success, Davis Delano finds 7 different instances where the mascot still remains and 7 where the mascot was revoked. For each of these cases, she finds 2 people who were opposed to the mascot and 2 people who thought the mascot should remain. She then summarizes her findings and gives some tips for those who want to contribute to the active removal of Indigenous mascots. We ask ourselves how people who are experiencing these Indigenous mascots on a direct level view them. As stated before, Davis Delano easily found multiple participants who stood on both sides. Why do these people see these things this way? What side do they stand on, and why? In one of the interviews on page 349, someone states, quote, "The arguments of the proponents have been very, very effective. It's often suggested that changing the mascot will involve a lot of expense. The administration fears loss of funding. So the argument some of the supporters of the mascot have play into the fears." Another person said, "We're in a state that is deeply embedded in the sports culture. Sports fans tend to be the most active supporters. Many of our strongest economic supporters are city leaders who are fans, and it's even more so at the state level. What contributes to retention is the deeply embedded traditions that are primarily associated with athletics." Some of the greatest concerns that supporters for these Indigenous mascots have is extreme passion for sport or the concern about economics. On page 369, Davis Delano refers to these people as, quote, "those in conservative sport worshipping communities." With these strong opinions, how can we continue to advocate for the dismissal of these mascots? At one point in her interviews, Davis Delano brings up a student who speaks of their elder involvement and claims it made all the difference. Page 357 of Delano's work, the student states, "I think had it been limited to just the students and none of our native leadership or elders had gotten involved, I don't believe it would have been successful. We had key people. That was the key. I think they could have been respected in the Native community, and it would not have made a difference, but they were respected in the community at large." Davis Delano concludes with some of the key things we can use to advocate against Indigenous mascots. She states on page 369, "I found no difference between the amount of commitment and time invested by the mascot opponents in elimination versus retention cases. So mascot opponents are not losing because of lack of effort. It is likely that they are losing for 3 main reasons. Their school and community settings contain more barriers, often because of greater conservatism and worship of sport. They are up against greater numbers of and or more powerful mascot supporters, and they need to thank some, but not most, of their actions." Another important quote by Davis Delano on page 369 that we can reflect on states, "To increase chances of elimination, mascot opponents should strive to increase the numbers and involvement of local and regional Native Americans on their side. In many communities, this is no easy task, given the barriers previously discussed, but increasing local and regional Native involvement may be the only ticket to legitimacy in the eyes of many non-Natives, especially those in conservative, sport-worshipping communities. Another paper we view as important when helping us learn these concepts is one of Kevin Brunel. This paper is called Race, Colonialism, and the Politics of Indian Sports Names and Mascots, the Washington Football Team Case. In this paper, Brunel discusses the case of the Washington football team. It has a very long racist history, from the time it was named to interviews as recent as 2014, where NFL players state that they don't think the name was going to change. Brunel shows the eventual stance that takes place against this team and how the change slowly comes. Senators, coaches, and players began to protest this team, but on page 9 it states, one 2013 poll found that 79% of Americans think the Washington football team should not have to change its name. Fortunately, the name change did take place, and Brunel leaves us on a positive note, saying that it's set for the action for other team names to change their names and mascots. Brunel has a lot to say about the Indigenous mascot issue in relation to settler colonialism. On page 2, it states, the present debate and politics regarding Indian sports names and mascots, such as with the case of the Washington football team's name, provides an excellent opportunity to politicize and center settler colonialism as a historical and contemporary structuring force of the United States. Of course, it is still important to note that these issues are taking place in Canada and other places where settler colonialism exists. Another section on page 1 and 2, Brunel states, the keynote speaker was Congresswoman Betty McCollum, who in discussing the controversy over the Washington, D.C. football team's name, noted that if a derogatory word for people who are Jewish, African American, or Chinese was proposed as a sports team's name, it wouldn't be allowed. No one would stand for it, but for some reason the term blank gets a free pass. The word in the quote, which I blanked out, is the same racial slur that was used as the Washington football team's previous name. I would like to relate this exact quote to the work of Cindy Blackstock and her YouTube video, How to Change Systemic Racism in Canada. In this video, at about 50 seconds in, Blackstock begins to discuss how it is crazy to her that people can see that racist acts against Black people are wrong, but these same people struggle to see that racist acts against Indigenous peoples are wrong because of the deeply rooted settler colonial system. This relates to Indigenous mascots because many people have trouble seeing the problem with Indigenous mascots. All they can see is that that's their team, and they don't even consider that the name might be a racial slur and how it might be affecting Indigenous peoples. In our next episode, Jessie will be back with me to help explain how Indigenous mascots relate to settler colonialism and many other big picture Indigenous issues. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you in the next episode.